Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, everybody. Given that I saw so many of you in MIDEM last week, including all of this panel, I have to remind myself that we're actually in New York and not on the French Riviera. But it's great to be here. Thanks very much for the invitation. And I can throw in I was going to say an English accent, not an English, a Welsh accent. So I shall do that. So ICMP, the International Confederation of Music Publishers, we are the global trade association for music publishers, and we represent the interests of our members on a global basis, particularly focusing on copyright reform and the behavior of collecting societies and so forth. The good news is that you are all members. You are members through your local MPAs, which gives us a truly global reach. The US board members of ICMP are Ralph Peer and Kathy Marsh from Music Notes. So we cover the full spectrum of publishing, from the tall to the small, music sales, my day job company. Many of you will know we are particularly active until most recently in the printed music sector, but also in the classical sector and the media sector. So ICMP, as I say, operates on a global basis. We go sometimes where we're not welcome, and we certainly say sometimes what people don't want to hear. Some of you would have seen a press release only yesterday that came out of ICMP and MIDEM regarding the situation in Spain and the collecting society there as Guy, and Teresa will be able to tell us more about that in a little while. So the panel, I'm very pleased to say they're all long-term colleagues, distinguished colleagues and friends, all preeminent in their own territories, but all with, as we all have, a major exposure, not just to what goes on in their own territories, but as we know, in an increasingly globalized music publishing business. So I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves, say a little bit about their issues. I will interject if and where necessary, and I hope at the end that we'll have some questions that between the five of us, I would hope that we'll be able to answer. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass to Jennifer.
Thanks very much, Chris. This is on. I'm Jennifer Mitchell, president of Casablanca and Red Brick Songs. We are a large independent music publisher in Canada, now known, I guess, in the United States as the enemy, for the moment. But, you know, we're not here to talk about politics. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about copyright. Hopefully I seem to be going in and out of this mic. In Canada, one of the issues that we're facing right now is copyright reform. And I think we have talked about this at prior AIMP summits, but I'm going to give you kind of a brief update on the situation. Back in 2012, the Copyright Act was amended by our then conservative-led government, and it was mandated to be reviewed in 5 years' time. But they never really said what kind of review that was supposed to be, which left sort of a vague notion of whether or not our Copyright Act could really be reviewed. In any event, we've spent the last couple of years extensively lobbying the government. After 2012, I think it was in 2015, we had a new Liberal government that came into power, and we've been very active trying to lobby that government to do a fulsome review of the Act in 2017. We were very lucky in the fall of 2017 to have the ICMP board come to Ottawa and engage with the Canadian music publishers to jointly lobby our government, which was successful. They decided to do a full review of our act, and right now we're in the process of having the act reviewed jointly by the Department of Heritage and by the Department of Innovation in Canada. So what all of that means is there's still a lot to be done. When they reviewed the act, when they amended the act back in 2012, there were a number of exceptions that were introduced into the act that basically reduced income for all of us and made enforcement rights more difficult. I'm just going to quickly go over what those things are. Actually, let me just back up a second. The Canadian Music Publishers Association, which is the CMPA, has a number of things on its agenda in addition to dealing with the exceptions. And probably the most important thing is extending the life of copyright. Because right now in Canada, life of copyright is life plus 50. Pretty much everywhere else in the United States and in most international standards is life plus 70. So that's the #1 item on our list. After that, we're looking at amending some of the exceptions that were introduced into the Act, including some exceptions that they created for backup copies, technological processes, and hosting services. And all of that is, if you want to get into the specifics of it, is pretty technical. But what it means at the end of the day is you received less money for broadcast mechanicals, you received not a lot of money for private copying, and it became much harder to enforce your copyrights in Canada. We also want the government to address the value gap that exists in Canada by treating internet intermediaries as more than dumb pipes and making them liable for infringing activities in certain circumstances. Another big issue that we're dealing with is our copyright board. Right now, we're looking at anywhere from 3 years to get decisions from the copyright board, and decisions are based on rates that are years past. We're not anywhere near close to dealing with current rates. So that definitely has to change. And then finally, we really want to make the private copying regime technologically neutral to cover audio recording devices such as digital audio recorders, tablets, and smartphones. Because right now, our private copying regime basically doesn't really exist. It was never extended to cover any additional media. So that money has really dried up for you in Canada. So back to the present day. Like I said, the good news is that the government agreed to review the Act. The good news is that they have 2 committees looking at it, and music publishers are basically in the process of giving testimony in front of those committees. But the bad news is that we have a federal election in the fall of 2019. So that means nothing is going to happen in the short term. The government will make recommendations, and then nothing will happen with those recommendations. So we will continue to lobby. We will wait to see what the recommendations say. If we love the recommendations when a new government is elected in 2019, then we will be lobbying to try to implement those recommendations. And if we don't, then we will be lobbying to try to change those recommendations. We are also continuing to work with the ICMP and NMPA to see if we can influence Ottawa by using foreign governments to put pressure in Canada, similar to what we did back in November of 2017. CMPA, for example, recently met with the US Embassy. And of course, as I joked at the beginning, we are dealing with some very complex events all happening at the same time. We have NAFTA going on. We have apparently a trade war happening. So there are lots of different elements in the mix, and we're just going to have to see how it plays out.
Thank you, Jennifer. I should say that going to Ottawa last year was a real highlight for me. It was my first real trip as the chairman of ICMP. And we were wonderfully hosted, a tremendous schedule of meetings and events. But I realized that if you want to change things in Canada, you don't say, well, that's what they do in America. That was first rule of what not to do to influence Canadians. So that said, we did have a strong message, because we do have a strong message. And we're set on a course, hopefully, and it encourages us to do what we do. Our next stop, in a similar vein, by the way, is South Africa. We'll be in South Africa before the end of the year, again seeking to institute major legislative change. And in the intervening period, I should also say that when we went to Canada, I think Japan was still a holdout in the 50 to 70 year regime. Japan now is moving to 70, and that is an unstoppable movement through the Japanese Parliament. So we're getting there, and we need to get there. But thank you. Okay, so let's come back to Europe. The major topic that we discussed at the ICMP board, we had two particular topics. One was Greece, which is still unresolved, and the second is Spain and SGAE. Teresa is an expert on both, and I will speak to us now with some passion about them, I'm sure. So, Teresa.
Thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, to AIMP for having me here. It's a pleasure to address to such a distinguished group of publishers. I am the president and CEO of a small independent company, Teddy Sound, and I'm also the president of the Spanish Music Publishers, the Independents, AIMP, that's the name of our association. And as president of that association, I want to thank you, Terry Nelson Carpenter, for having attended our seminar. It's been an honor to have a person representing AIMP and making a presentation explaining to our Spanish members what's all about AIMP. So thank you, Terry, for joining us. When I just was elected president of the Spanish publishers, I have many concerns in mind. I had several goals. There were several issues that were bothering me a lot. And I thought that I will concentrate my office on those. As you know, in Spain, we speak 4 different languages. We are non-Anglo speaking, so my concern was that our repertoire was going to be a third-class repertoire, considering all the international negotiations, all the alliances, all the hubs that we'll be collecting on the digital world. So I thought I would be working on that. But what happens that the situation in SGAE has been gone from bad to worse. So a lot of our effort and a lot of our budget is devoted to try to solve the problems. Yesterday, when I was flying to New York, I was just trying to make a short chronology of facts to explain you today. And I ended up with 3 pages of short chronologies, so I thought, oh my God, that's going to take longer than the whole panel. So I'd rather try to explain you what's going on very quickly, and then a key dates, so you can have an idea of what we are talking about. In Spain, we are having a problem. Is that if I go to my chronology, it all started at the end of the 90s. Usually, TV stations, the private TV stations, never wanted to pay the fees that SGAE asked for the licenses. So they were always having big fights. SGAE had to take them to court. And finally, SGAE got paid because the court said that SGAE was right, so they ended up paying. What happened at the end of the 90s, a veteran for our industry, I'm afraid, went to visit one of the CEOs of one of the Mediaset group and told him, listen, I have an idea. It's going to be simpler. You will save a lot of money in lawyers. I've got a way so you can recoup the money you pay to SGAE. And so he invented something that we called chopinescas at the time, that it was to have a gentleman playing the piano. He was playing Chopin for a long time, and the TV station had settled publishing division. They have registered all those public domain arrangements, although there was non-arrangement at all, but it was just deposit at SGAE as if it were an arrangement. And that lasted for hours, so the amount of money they got from that was tremendous. So at the time, I was at the board of SGAE, at the executive board, and when we saw the huge amount that gentleman in the night was getting. Then we had to stop the distribution. We went to court, and well, that was the beginning of it. So other TV stations thought that, wow, that's a good idea. So they started filling the night. When we say night, we mean from 2 a.m. till 7 a.m. That's when less than 1% of the viewers are watching TV. They are getting from 40% to 80%, depending on the channels, on the revenue that they have been paying to Sky back to their publishing divisions or their group of authors. So it's not only that they are getting all that money back, is that this means that the value of the primetime minute is going to diminish, because they have blanket license, so there is a certain amount of money that has to be distributed among our copyrights along the day. So when the night takes so much money, then there is less money to be distributed during the day. What happens that, why was Chopin so interesting? Because Sky has some multipliers. So when it's classical music, there is a multiplier to help the classical music. So the income was multiplied per 60. Then they invented other tricks, like having inaudible background music on all kinds of programs, even on talk shows, every kind of programs. Whereas a cooking program, wherever, there's always background music. And the TV station publishing divisions, they just register that and they claim. And what happened that even if the human ear cannot listen to it, they just claim it and they get paid for it. So all this is just getting out value of our minutes we have on TV. What's the big problem? This is not a fight between some these publishers or those publishers. No. It means that Mary Megan's Peer Music may have a hit on TV one night because that song is a very important song and it's been included in a TV show. But that's once, just one night and for a few minutes. What happens? The other music from the TV channels is all over every night, and they may have this, we call it the wheel, because it keeps turning. So when they finish a round, they start again, and it's night after night, and so they accumulate such a large amount of minutes of music that when one of her songs is on TV, she may be getting 1/10 of what she used to get before. As an example, a catalog that we represent in Spain that has a lot of a series, we used to get, let's say, that was for a local channel. We used to get 250 euros per episode. Nowadays, when that same series gets broadcasted, we are just getting around 20 euros. This is an international series. It doesn't mean that's a problem with my songs or her songs or the TV channel songs. It's something that's affecting the entire community. So we've been, you cut me if I'm too long, please. What we've been doing is that the majors and our association, we file a lawsuit against Sky because the Spanish IP law provides that it's their obligation that to make sure that no users get privileged usage of their own music. And the society was doing nothing. So we filed a lawsuit, and then in order to speed things, we managed to get an arbitration process, and it seems it was a very good idea, because an arbitration under the WIPO umbrella was something that all parties were supposed to accept the results, but we were so sure that we were right that we just wanted, and it finally got finished. The results were great. The arbitration said that the maximum amount that the TV stations could recoup was between 10 and 20%. So it was said that it would be 15%. This guy just implemented that for the last December distribution. But what happens is the TV stations file a lawsuit against the society, and it's unbelievable that it's in a very quick way they could stop it. And because a judge said that it was, well, it may be, it was not, the judge didn't say that the TV stations were right. They were just, it was a problem of procedure. So Sky could not implement what has been decided under the arbitration. So the Sky board, who is now at present controlled on an 80% by the people from the TV stations, decided not only to go back to the previous situation, but they also implemented some other changes that will help them a lot. For example, the music that we collect from TV sets on bars was distributed only to the music performed during daytime. Why? Because the law prohibits that the bars are open from 2 a.m. till 7 a.m. This is why. So now this new, well, the board, the present board just changed the rules. So now they will be also getting a share on the TV sets distribution. So this is the kind of board we are having. And just to update you, during the last board meeting, just in case some of the board members were still against what we call the will, they read two different letters, one from A3 Media and the other one from Mediaset, telling the board members that in case they dare to vote anything against their interest, they will be filed a lawsuit, but on a, you know, what's the, sorry, I'm not very familiar with the legal vocabulary in English. It's what's gonna be criminal, under a criminal. They will be persecuted under criminal law for fighting against their interests. So some of them were thinking about their families, their houses, their kids, so they decided either to leave the room, not to vote, or voted in favor of what the TV stations proposed. So those who have been fighting recently, well, in the last few years against this sort of, this kind of, well, this group of people, we've all received threats, personal threats, and it's funny, they may not know that I'm here because usually the night before I have to appear in any public place, I receive some threats through text messages. And well, yeah, it sounds unbelievable, but it's how it is. And maybe do you want to ask something?
Well, I mean, I'd have to say, well, thank you. I mean,
Oh, I just forgot something. There is a police investigation by the intellectual property unit that's been going on for 2 years. So if that investigation had been closed, maybe some of them would be arrested and things would have changed. But as the investigation is not getting closed at all, so they're still running the society.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, you couldn't make it up. I mean, it's astonishing, isn't it? And the reason this is important, this is not a Spanish problem. This is a global problem because it's all of our repertoire. And I have to say that there's no dressing it up. This is a scam, and it should be exposed as a scam. The ICMP press release of yesterday calls it a scam, and we should be resolved into having a zero tolerance policy towards indefensible and corrupt collection society practice. And it's not pleasant, and it does get personal, but we have to call it out. So thank you, Teresa. It'll run and run, so keep watching. Thank you. Okay, so I think we're going to go east.
We are.
We're heading east. Mary Megan, please.
Is this on? Yes. Okay. First of all, I mean, just to follow up on what Teresa and Chris have said, this is a major, major issue for our community to have an important...
I think we can't hear.
No? Okay.
That's better.
Have to be closer. This is what Teresa and then Chris followed up on. This is a major issue for our community to have a European collection society with this level of corruption, this level of issues where people are not being paid what they're owed, and there's really a continued process of continuing all the writers and the publishers who are on this board. Publishers who oppose these practices are no longer sitting on the board. So certainly, watch this space. I think ICMP was right to come out with a very strongly worded press release. Sky at some point has to realize that the international societies and publishers and writers are not going to put up with this. So, an important area. But I'm not actually here to talk about Spain. I'm here to talk about Asia. Particularly Terry and Chris asked me to speak a little bit about China. I don't think I fully introduced myself. Mary Megan Peer, the Deputy CEO of Pure Music. We have offices in Spain and in the US. Many of you know me from the ASCAP board. But we're also in 26 other countries around the world, including Asia. We've had a presence there for quite a while. And we have wholly owned companies in Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Beijing, and Singapore. So we have a fairly extensive network there, certainly a network the same size as any of the larger local publishers. And it continues to be an important market for us. Certainly the growth there is rapid. We are also part of AIMPS, which is essentially the Asian Music Publishers Group. It's something like a regional NMPA, so it means that we're involved in a lot of the larger questions that are going on. In terms of China, Chris had suggested it would be useful to speak a little bit about the society there, digital, because that's obviously what we hear the most about, and then a little bit on copyright reform, or if you can even call it that. To start with, MCSC is the collection society there. It is pretty small if you think about it on a global basis. They collect about $33 million a year. That's about what the Portuguese society collects. Not that they're necessarily the best reference society, but if you think about it, there are 1.4 billion people in China and about 10 million people in Portugal. So there's a little bit of a comparison for you. Part of the reason their collections are so low is because there's been a history with broadcasters, particularly government-owned broadcasters who are the most important ones in China, of not having to pay any broadcast performance rights because government said, well, these are our stations. This is propaganda for our Communist Party. No rights need to be paid. That began to change about 4 years ago. So now the largest, particularly national stations, are licensed. But there's still, I read that there are 3,000 broadcasters in China, and something like 100 of them are licensed. So you can tell that there's certainly a lot of room to grow there. Another area that they've had some trouble with, but they're making strides on, are the karaoke bars. It's kind of like general licensing, but obviously karaoke, there's a heavy use of music. And MCSC has successfully partnered with Kavka, which is the group that represents master owners. A little bit like what PPL and PRS have done in the UK. So they're jointly licensing these clubs. This cuts down on their costs of administering the license and has increased some revenue, and I think also enforced some compliance with the laws. But MCSC certainly has a long way to go on many types of rights collections. About 25% of their income currently comes from digital, and I would assume that's going to grow. They were not particularly aggressive in licensing the digital players at the beginning, and they've certainly tried to step up in that front, but there is an incredible amount of digital music in China, and so the fact that they have about 7 million in collections is fairly low. To talk a little bit about the DSPs and the digital scene there, you've probably heard that Apple Music has launched, and there are a couple other smaller launches of international DSPs, but really the majority of the market is the local services. There are 3 companies that control 99% of the market, Tencent, Alibaba, and NetEase. and they all have their own music services and then license through to others such as QQ and KK and others that I'm sure you've heard of. All of these services they've developed kind of wide audiences. They are doing a lot of the same things that we see Western digital services do. So they are supporting artists with direct relationships, with exclusive content. They are hosting their own fan events. They're doing a lot of playlisting. I think there is also some pay for playlisting, similar to how we've seen in other markets. But they are all growing very rapidly. In terms of copyright reform, or lack thereof, they probably heard that in last fall, their government got involved with these digital services, saying that they could no longer do exclusive deals. Most of the record labels in China own their own publishing companies, so they were going to one service and saying, I will give you this content on an exclusive basis for a year, 2 years, a set period of time. So it meant that the consumers really had to use every service to get the full range of product from a local perspective. And about 80% of the market there is local music. The government said this was really a poor position to put consumers in, so they insisted that the services cross-license rather than allow all these exclusive deals. So if you gave Tencent your entire catalog, they had to then go and license Alibaba and NetEase, and then presumably pay you through for that. I'm not sure how much that actually happened. I guess this changed the market somewhat for a few months, but they've really gone back to the exclusive profile. It has made all of them a lot more money. Most of these services are advertising supported. I think the 3 major services have among them 1.2 billion subscribers with less than 100 million who are paying anything on a regular basis. The rest are advertising supported. For comparison, I think Spotify's recent figures are about 90 million advertising supported subscribers and 70 million paid subscribers. So really these services are absolutely huge. But so they've gone back to the more exclusive deals, which presumably make them more money but are less favorable to the consumer. It seems unlikely with Tencent's upcoming US IPO, which is going to happen sometime in the second part of this year, and is going to, I think I read it's going to be the 4th largest tech IPO in the US ever. It seems unlikely that the Chinese government is going to step in and do anything again with regards to copyright reform before that happens, because I suspect a lot of folks in the Chinese government will be benefiting from that IPO. Obviously, that's my opinion, but I think we realize that there's some ties there. So I don't think that we're going to see a lot of changes on the copyright front.
Okay, just on China, the last century has really been about the preeminence of the Anglo-American repertoire. The Chinese are notoriously exporters of culture. How do you see the repertoire mix within China, do you think?
I have heard for about the past 10 years that it's 80% local and 20% international. And I don't know if we have enough information to change that. I would think with digital being so important, it would continue to increase because there's no cost of actually obtaining it. Mm-hmm. But they also have a very strong local music scene, and they certainly, the tonalities in the music are different. I think there are a lot of folks who don't listen to Western music at all outside of the big cities.
Okay, well, China, a big topic, and perhaps there'll be some questions from the floor on China at the end of the session. But I know Jer has been patiently waiting.
Very patiently.
Jer and I have a long-standing relationship when Jer herself was the DG of ICMP. And Jer is, she'll say for herself, is now based in Brussels. And this is the work of Brussels and the copyright legislation framework is very much her meat and drink. So there you go, there's a build-up. Jeff.
Yay! Thank you, Chris. So yes, I now have my own IP and copyright firm, working mostly with creative sector clients in Brussels and in Geneva at WIPO. It's very nice to be here, and I want to thank Terry and Michael for inviting me. The state of the industry globally is a huge theme to deal with. In Europe alone, we're dealing with other issues right now, GDPR, Brexit, and all these populist governments that seem to have sprung up all of a sudden. But yet, as Michelle said this morning on your panel earlier on the US state of the industry, where you're working all out on the MMA, likewise in Brussels we are working pretty much all out on the digital single market, and particularly the proposed copyright directive. To just move on from there, some background in terms of global. According to recent IFPI figures, global recorded music revenues increased by 8.1% last year, it's 2017. Streaming revenues grew 41.1% to become the largest revenue source, driven by 176 million users of paid subscription accounts. And this is the third consecutive year of growth following 15 years of revenue decline. Like many reports and findings on our industry these days, we should welcome the growth with a sort of cautious optimism. And while it is the industry's third consecutive year of growth, despite the recent uplift, revenues for 2017 are still only 68% of the market's peak in 1999. So while piracy, we know, is a consistent and constant threat, the biggest issue for the industry globally, and particularly in Europe, is the threat that safe harbour legislation causes in terms of the large on-demand services being able to take advantage of the same legislation to negotiate highly unfavourable rates for the industry, which in turn has a knock-on effect for the whole ecosystem. Safe harbour and the resulting issue that we identified, and in Europe we call the value gap or transfer of value, is something most of you have heard about by now. And while safe harbour legislation was written into early internet legislation to protect passive hosting servers from user uploads, we now have active service providers taking full advantage of the legislation when negotiating licenses with rights holders. We know, for example, that YouTube has a conservative estimate of 1 billion users of music, yet Safe Harbour helps to shield these and such global giants and allows them to refuse to license and refuse to compensate properly. The value gap is therefore the biggest loss to all of us rights holders right now, and we in Europe are hoping that Article 13 of the proposed copyright directive will be a positive step towards making responsible the services who are making content available. The Value Gap campaign to achieve full and fair value for music in the digital market is hugely important in Europe. All groupings across all the creative sectors have been working together over the last 3 years in Europe to get this loophole in the law addressed and preferably eliminated. Safe harbour laws, as we know, were never intended to be used as a business model. We know that users are prepared to pay for music-based content, and so we have to try and bolster the various initiatives, both free via ad-supported services and subscription-based models. And we have to create the value for those that create the content. And despite our tiredness, we have to keep working on this. We have to keep speaking about it. We have to keep fighting on, as there is also little choice available, as we have to license. If all of us rights holders in the value chain are not paid fairly for rights, then artists can't be paid either, and getting paid fairly is impossible when there is not a level playing field. Those are all the arguments that we have been putting in Europe for the past 3 years, consistently to the various institutions. Where we're at right now in relation to the European Copyright Proposal Directive is that it's going to what's called trialogue. Trialogue is the 3 different actors in the European Union: the Council, which is member states, the European Parliament, which are the elected representatives of the European Union, so parliamentarians, members of Parliament, and the third one is the Commission, of course, the European Commission, which is the civil service. All of those 3 are more or less in agreement about where we should go. The Council of Member States has just agreed on various texts, changes, and an overall text that will go to what are called these trialogue discussions. And we are currently waiting for the European Parliament to take a vote in two places. The first one will be within the Legal Committee of the European Parliament, where pretty much everybody on this panel has been working in some way or another over the last couple of years, regardless of location. We've had people from Canada visit the European Parliament, we've had the Indies, we've had majors, we've had ICMP. Everybody's been working on this for quite some time. We expect that the vote on the 21st will, to some extent, go in, let's say, the favour of rights holders, in the direction which we want, which is some recognition that that what platforms do is a communication to the public. Once it does, there will be a vote in plenary of the Parliament, so that's everybody all together, and then the new presidency of the European Union, which is Austria, which will take over on the 1st of July, will be the ones responsible for acting as the Sherpa to hopefully see this proposal through. So that's the current state of where we're at on this. I think that globalization for all of us means that consumers all over the world, regardless of the language they speak, have an input into breaking the hit songs. And this is something that's, I think, really important. China, which Mary Megan mentioned, will be probably a #1 music market in the next maybe 8 to 10 years. It now has legal services. One of the worst offenders in recent years, VKontakte in Russia, is now licensed. India is on a big transition curve, and while the continent of Africa has low penetration services, it is moving along in places where there is a strong culture of music tradition. So to kind of end on my input on a semi-positive note, I do think that we're in a fairly good place, certainly relative to where we were a few years ago. We have a united voice, which I think is really critical. That's regardless of whether you're indies or majors, publishers or labels, or collective management organizations. Very few industries have survived the decline of ours, and the fact that we have is testament to the power of music itself. Thank you.
For those of you who are dedicated EU watchers, you'll know that the Austrians are following the Bulgarians, who are currently,
Yes.
I think, yes. So can I ask you, Joe, when this is all over, of course, it'll just all start again. We'll e-commerce directive,
Yes.
new commission in 2019.
Yes, it could. I mean, next year there are elections to the European Parliament, and then there will be a new commission. Some are even questioning whether the copyright proposal will actually go through before the new parliament. It depends. It's extremely, well, I mean, you're aware organizations like EDRI and the European EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, are hugely influential, have major platforms. They're investing heavily in ensuring that there are lots of commentaries, legal, academic, and others via civil society that are attempting to, let's say, cast doubt on the efficacy of particularly Article 13, which is really important. So all of those factors can come into play, and so who knows whether we'll even get there or not. So that's it's a big issue. We hope so, obviously, but it's a big question, and there is a tight timeline.
Well, it has been a long, long haul, I have to say, but I think we're cautiously optimistic. As a Brit, I guess we're going to miss out on all of this European fun. Personally, I'm very sad about that, but I understand that the implementation will follow the usual time frame.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, once it's all decided, then there's a couple of years for it to actually sort of kick in.
And I think if we're out, the UK will be out of the EU by 2019. But my understanding
2022, I heard today.
Oh, really? Excellent. Good. But I think we will be enshrining the directive into UK law. I should just say that, you know, everybody has to be somewhere. ICMP is in Brussels, and that's very much been the center of gravity of our work over this directive. But it doesn't stop us, as I say, as some might say, interfering in other jurisdictions. And I think it's also fair to say that it's what happens in Europe will be watched by lawmakers, both here in the US and in other parts of the world. So it's been a concerted effort by all publishers. We've achieved some very important exceptions to some of the more damaging and far-reaching provisions in the directive. For example, there are exceptions in the area of sheet music, which is a tremendously important building block of music making, and for literally hundreds of music publishers around the world, a careless provision for sheet music would very much threaten not those businesses, but the business of making music from a young age. So I would pay tribute to everybody in the industry who's been involved in getting us to the best possible state. We now leave it to the politicians. What could possibly go wrong? We shall see. Okay, well, thank you all. We've covered a lot of ground there, and naturally we've inclined to those things that on which we're most expert, and the panelists are, as I say, are distinguished in their own fields. But we are here. We'll take questions on any subject, and we have a few minutes now towards the end of our panel to do that. So please, from the floor. Ah, what a surprise, Emmanuel. Yeah.
What are you really going to do? What can you do? The courts seem to be fighting this guy every time there's a lawsuit. They seem to be giving a middle finger to both WIPO and CSAC. So what's left for you to do?
Well, that's a good question. Well, thanks to ICMP, CSAC has been quite active, unusually active, but they still haven't provided any strong resolution against us guys, so we wait and see what happens during the next board. What we are currently exploring are some ways out. There was a need for Spain to implement the previous directive, not the one that Jer mentioned. And it's, well, the Spanish law should be amended. It was amended a couple of months ago. So if nothing happens at the end of the year, we will be able to have we will be able to have in place other collecting societies or agencies collecting. But it's so early, and we need some way of escape in an urgent way. So that's the problem, is that the legal solutions may come, but you know, some of you may remember that in 2011, the police went into Sky and took the CEO away, Mr. Eduardo Bautista. He is not yet gone to trial. The trial we are supposed to have it starting end of this year or beginning of next year. So if the law is so slow, can you imagine? So this is why we are considering, and as me as President of the Independents, I'm having meetings with different key players of the industry, and of course, together with our friends from the major companies, we are in conversations all the time, trying to figure out where to go. But the problem is that we are receiving a lot of offers on the digital area. That's something quite easy to handle. But what do we do with the bars, with the venues? What do we do with the hairdressers that they also pay rights for the performances? So who's going to go to the classical music venues, or who's going to be collecting all that kind of rights? So this is why although we are in the digital era and it seems that everything is very easy, it's not that easy as it sounds. So having these digital solutions maybe just for the digital and TV and radio. But what about the rest? We are not in conditions to say, well, as we are getting so much money from digital and we are getting so much from TV or radio stations, then we can just forget about the rest. Now the rest is, it may be more than 50% on our revenues, so we need to consider everything before taking any further steps. So,
but it's a perfectly fair question, because I found myself issuing a statement from Cannes, which was pretty much the same statement I issued from the place I'd previously come from, where I can't remember where we'd last been. So, you know, we run the risk of looking weak by simply condemning this guy without taking definitive action. I think the point is, of course, that a well-running reciprocal international society relationship model has worked well and does work well, and the last thing we'd want to do is to break that apart. And we are calling very much on CSAC to you know, get their membership in order. But ultimately, I think it's a question of mandates and repertoire. And publishers eventually will, and they are, will seek unilateral solutions for withdrawing their repertoire from organizations where they're palpably receiving no recompense for their repertoire. So, you know, I can't say too much, but other than the words will have to stop at some point, and publishers of international repertoire will be looking to take any measure they can to, as I say, to look at an alternative resting place for their repertoire in such territories. So, yes, Mark. Well, which Spanish government? There was one last week, and there's a different one this week. Yeah. Jay.
Yeah, sorry, I'm a resident of Spain and married to a Spaniard, so I think I'm also maybe can answer that question as well as Teresa. Look, I think the Spanish government did actually address some of these issues during the Teddy Baptista period a few years ago, and were quite involved. But since then, there's been a lot of political changes. There's also a number of issues that you have heard about to do with independence and other things that are happening in Spain, and so it's a question of priorities, in my opinion. I don't know how the new government will be. They have appointed a new minister for culture that seems that could be somebody that could work on some of this, but you know, it's a big thing. I also think that they're just very big issues when you're talking about setting up an alternative system, because you can't have a two-track system, so that's the problem. It's like you have one thing that's working, half working or not working, and then you have to kind of stop it and start something else, and it's just just to kind of add in on Emmanuel's point, it's like it's difficult. We've seen that elsewhere in Europe.
Okay, we have one more question.
If I may add something to reply his question, is that we've been visiting the ministry on a monthly basis. We started as independents visiting. We went back together with the majors. We went back together with ICMP representatives. We went back there with CSAC representation. Every visit, the reply was quite sort of different, but they ended up saying, well, this is a sort of a family fight among, in Sky we have audiovisual, we have grandeur, we have publishers, and we have authors and composers. So they have no idea how to solve it. And even now with the changes of the government, the bureaucrats there, those on the lower level will remain the same ones, and they don't know how to address the issue. And I have to be very honest, the TV stations are very powerful. TV stations need, you know, the power of, you know, they control some the political parties. They need them. So in the past, when I was I think it was in 2005 that I was president of the Spanish publishers. I went to the tribunal for the competition to file a complaint because the national stations like TV1, TV3, those who are paid without taxes, were competing with their publishing divisions with us. And the people who were there told me, listen, you are absolutely right, but there's nobody upstairs that will ever sign accepting your complaint. They didn't even accepted the complaint because nobody wants to be against any TV station. They are powerful. They all belong to political parties, and those political parties need the power of the stations for their political campaigns. So that's another problem.
Okay. We've reached time. Thank you. But we will be here after the panel, so if there are questions, we will take them. Thank you very much for coming to the Spanish panel. But seriously, thank you to all of the speakers for their preparation and delivery. Very much appreciated. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Chris.